Hello, and welcome to the President's class at the Philosophical Research Society. My name is Greg Salyer. I'm the president, and I'm happy to offer this series, Seeking Wisdom in Troubled Times, now in the pandemic, and from home. All of us at PRS are safe and well, and we hope you are too. One thing that the pandemic has thrown into high relief for us and our Los Angeles community is just how much of a place we are. Manly Hall's esoteric library, encased in dark wood but bathed in sunlight. Our beautiful courtyard with the loquats ripening now. Our quaint bookstore with its eclectic and fascinating titles. These and other elements of the place make us wistful. We will return there at some point, and we will be even more grateful when we do. Thank you to my colleagues at PRS, Aster, Kelly, Matthew, and Amanda for keeping us going as an online institution. Thank you, viewers, for joining us here on YouTube. Last week, we discussed what stories do, along with why and how they change. We saw that stories are life-sustaining and world-generating. Despite these powerful functions, however, stories are limited and limiting, since they cannot account for everything, especially in a world that is constantly changing, sometimes dramatically. Stories are maps for living, and by their very nature, maps reduce the world to what is manageable and meaningful. But these maps, these myths, always fail, and they almost always fail as the result of a catastrophic intrusion of something outside the map. Some new or overlooked feature of the world that has not otherwise been accounted for, like, say, a pandemic. We saw that our first and natural response to such a challenge to our deepest stories is to reaffirm them in spite of evidence to the contrary. As we're thrown into a liminal zone of anxiety and uncertainty, we continue to cling to them. Eventually, however, a new story emerges, and we have a choice. Do we close our eyes to the new thing in the world, or do we venture into the unknown, open and waiting to be taught by the universe and participate in the creation of a new story, and thereby a new world? In the last lecture, we took a wide view of that process. In this lecture, we look at how new stories emerge, and we focus tightly on one story and one character to see in greater detail how his new story emerged. In the discussion of stories changing and new stories emerging, we had at some point to come to the biblical character Job. His is an ancient story and one of the finest works of literature bequeathed to us. Tennyson called it the greatest poem of ancient and modern times, and many other writers and scholars have recognized its genius. Its origins are murky, but can probably be dated to around the 6th century BCE, a time of profound advancement and wisdom across the globe. In this century, we have the Hebrew prophets, the poetry and prophecy of the Babylonian exile, the great religious innovator Zoroaster, the mystic philosopher Pythagoras, the enlightenment of the Buddha, the beginnings of Jainism with Mahavira, the moral religion of Confucius, or Confucius, and the founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu. This text, Job, belongs in such company. Appropriately enough, the book of Job is found in the genre of Ketuvim, or wisdom writings in the Hebrew Bible. Generally, this genre is marked by difficult teachings using innovative poetic and prose forms and devices. As you will see, this ancient text meets all those criteria, especially that of a story for seekers of wisdom. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. This is an omniscient narrator speaking, and as such, we tend to believe the voice we hear right from the beginning because of its perspective. There's an almost fairy tale quality to the story, and we can tell that a lesson is coming. Aesop, if he existed at all, would have been writing about this time as well, and would have recognized the form of this story. Note that Job also offers sacrifices for his sons, because it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. A small detail adds much to our understanding of the main character. What appears at the beginning as profound piety will in the end be seen as a tragic flaw. The ending of the introduction is also telling. Thus did Job continually. Job was not a fair-weather follower of God. He is dedicated and diligent, and the implication from the text is that the story was working. This man has his bases covered, his I's dotted, his T's crossed. He and God have an agreement. If I do X, God will do Y, and Z will not happen. Job's offerings constitute the ancient equivalent of a contract, where the parties look at the cut-open animals and say, "May it thus be done to me if I do not fulfill the requirements of this contract." All is good for Job. I mean, the world is dangerous, and so is God. But Job has this contract, so he and his family at least will be okay. We can imagine him thinking that he has the world mapped, and his story is secure. You can already sense the catastrophes forming like storm clouds on the horizon. The story cannot last, but the reason is shocking. It turns out that God violates the contract, not Job. Enter now a character named Satan, who bets that Job will curse God if he loses everything. This figure is among the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, and bears no resemblance to the New Testament figure of Satan, much less his images as the devil. This Satan is more of a prosecutor for a grand jury of one. He also has some trickster qualities, such as being a gambler, and how his actions move the story forward. He bets God that Job's piety is transactional rather than altruistic. That is, Job offers sacrifices to God because God has, quote, put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side, unquote. God takes that bet, and Job begins counting his catastrophes. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said the Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels, and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. In terms of storytelling, you have to love this paragraph. It's just a cascade of loss and suffering, and the brilliant phrase, while he was still speaking, serves to mark the ridiculousness of it all, echoing the ridiculousness of the bet in the first place. It's almost as if the storyteller is in a hurry to get to the good parts. So he is just going to get all this suffering told in one paragraph. The bet itself is similar. It's a naked plot device to get to the real stuff that comes later on. The text then reads, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's right, Job. Hold on to that story. It's still working. There's just something weird in the air. These things happen. Just bad luck, mate. These ridiculous anomalies will pass, and soon you can get back to your secure piety and double sacrifices. Actually, my assessment is not quite fair to Job because I'm referring to a line from the narrator. Job's response is actually this. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. As we saw last week, this is Job clinging desperately, albeit heroically, to the story he has known and lived. It is a massive rationalization that happens also to be true. This notion of speaking truth before you actually know it also happens to be a feature of new stories emerging from the old ones. That is, sometimes they look and sound similar, but include an esoteric aspect that even the teller does not quite see yet. We'll come back to this notion near the end. For now, let us mark this passage and note the powerful symbolism of Job shedding the emblems of his former self. Things get worse and worse to the point where Job has lost his children, their homes, his livestock, and he is sitting among the ashes, scraping his loathsome sores with a piece of broken pottery. The symbolism here is almost too painful to bear. The tension too tautly wound, the language too visceral. Then a voice is heard. Surely it is a voice of comfort and relief for all this suffering. It is Job's wife who looks at him and says, curse God and die. The late Harold Bloom called Job's wife the hero of the story because she's the only one who makes any sense of the fate that has befallen her husband and family. Job holds on, though, and refuses to curse God, but he is beginning to lose his grip on the old story, and a new story is in its birth pangs. The catastrophes keep coming for Job, now hidden in the form of 3 friends who, stunned by the suffering they see in Job, sit without speaking for 7 days and nights. While it is only a single sentence in the text, it reveals one of the redeeming qualities of his friends, and it is this: no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. When stories change and suffering inevitably appears, the role of a friend can be to sit in silence with you. I once heard a sermon on suffering in which the minister suggested, don't just do something, stand there. Exactly right. The sufferer is becoming a new person, shedding his old skin, emerging from a previous existence, and now, in the stage of mourning the loss of his old story, he finds no comfort in it, even from his friends. Silence has another function too. It helps language catch up to the experience of loss. We often experience this lag between language and love, say, when the words, I love you, ring too hollow for such an intense and unique experience. We are experiencing something in love that is not on our map, some new reality that our story cannot account for. So why would we say anything at that point, especially if it involves loss and suffering? Writing about her beloved and complicated hometown of Los Angeles during the pandemic, Linnell George notes, quote, silence has become a shelter. I've begun telling people I know and love that language has not caught up with the expanse of my emotions. My feelings are too new and seem to occupy some unexplored territory of both place and self, unquote. I too have been sitting in silence myself these last several weeks, waiting for language to discover my two new feelings in the pandemic. When well-meaning people asked what I thought or had to say, I said nothing. Language had not caught up with such a new experience. The liminal zone is not a place for words, but a shelter of silence. Had Job's friends remained silent, they might have become the heroes of the story. However, they eventually speak. In their various and poetic ways, they charge Job with sin. This is his fault, they inform him, and they have good theology and great eloquence to tell him so. Theirs is a harsh interpretation of their friend's loss, and you may have experienced something similar when friends have more allegiance to a story than to you. In this case, Job's acute agonies are sacrificed on the altar of a pre-existing story, and it is clearly for the sake of maintaining that story rather than actually comforting Job. By the way, and for what it's worth, had Job's friends aggressively sided with him, they would be equally wrong because they would still be abetting the old story. Again, silence would have been better than words here. There's much more involved in this experience than what Job and his friends think there is. And the narrator has already tipped us off to this fact. But there's even more than the narrator conveys. To borrow a metaphor from Jesus, delicious wine of the emerging new story cannot be held in the leaky old wineskin of the previous story. We now enter what the author considers the most important part of the story, which is actually poetry and not prose. The three friends appear in chapter 2, and the climax of the story begins in chapter 38 of 42. What happens in between is a 4-part conversation on the nature of human suffering and the nature of a God who would allow it. Of course, the reader already knows the character of this God from the introduction. Job's suffering occurs not because of a God who is theologically trapped between his own omniscience and human free will, as many interpreters read this text. Neither does Job's suffering occur because, as his friends will argue, he has sinned against God. Remember, this is a God who will induce suffering to win a bet, a God who will treat Job's sincere piety as a poker chip. Already then, we know that both Job and his friends are propping up a story that is wrong, which is to say, it no longer fits Job's experience. It is an outdated map, and as readers, we can see the larger world that they cannot see. Why does the story continue on for so long then? From our perspective, and for our purposes in this lecture, it would be to let the old story exhaust itself, to examine it for cracks and fissures, to turn it over and over, and to make sure it is still viable. As we shall see, it is not. But the process is the same for us. When our stories are threatened by events they cannot account for, we not only cling to that story, we also examine it, test it, make sure it is not broken. We call in our friends to ask them to confirm our rightness. It's not me, it's her, right? For some 36 chapters, Job and his friends do precisely that. And it is understandable that they would do so in poetry. After suffering comes silence, and after silence comes words. Words, however, must adapt themselves to this new thing in the world. And the best kind of language for such a process is poetry. Why is that the case, you may well ask? It is because prose is the language of the old story, a story well told and well lived. Language reflects life, and when life shatters, so does our language. To rebuild our lives, we need the language of paradox and irony. That is not to say that prose cannot be helpful or employ paradox, but it is in poetry that paradox finds a special home. And when new stories emerge, it is paradox that must go to work. Paradox, irony, and similar devices are language turning in on itself, just as life has turned in on itself. Poetry is also the language of the sacred, recognizing, as it does, that the sacred is beyond language. But we need language to take us to the threshold, and not allow us to conflate it with the sacred. As the literary critic Cleanth Brooks put it in his essay, The Language of Paradox, we may approach the problem in this way. The poet has to work by analogies. All of the subtler states of emotion necessarily demand metaphor for their expression. The poet must work by analogies, but the metaphors do not lie in the same plane or fit neatly edge to edge. There is a continual tilting of the planes, necessary overlappings, discrepancies, contradictions. Even the most direct and simple poet is forced into paradoxes far more often than we think, if we are sufficiently alive to what he is doing. Even before Brooks, the great Christian existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard noted, paradox is not a concession, but a category, an ontological definition which expresses the relation between an existing cognitive spirit and an eternal truth. As we shall see, Job, his friends, and even God agree. Put more simply, a new story appears as paradoxical because it's overturning a previous orthodoxy. Job counters each friend in 3 rounds of accusation, and the result is like a courtroom where the arguments are conducted in poetry. Here's a small taste from Job's opening lament. For my sighing comes as my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. And here is Eliphaz the Temanite, his friend. For affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. The man is born to trouble, as the sparks fly upward. As for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause. He does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. In his 1954 work, Answer to Job, psychologist Carl Jung argues insightfully that the three friends are actually three accusatory voices in Job's own mind, which actually makes them even more powerful. Challenges and responses continue for nearly 40 chapters in the book of Job and include biting satire directed at Job, the friends, and at God. It is also some of the most evocative and eloquent poetry the world has seen. Eventually, Job grows tired of his friends' conventional explanations for his predicament, namely, that all this loss and suffering is somehow his fault, his most grievous fault, and a mea culpa will end it. He knows his friends are wrong, and he kept his part of the contract, so he cries out for a referee to judge the situation. To use the court metaphor, if Job is the defendant and Satan the prosecutor, then Job demands a ruling from the judge. Is his map not right? Is his story not valid? Why does God violate the long-standing agreement about the way the world works? Did he not have it all figured out with his double sacrifices and precious piety, this wonderful man named Job? Finally, Job gets a response, and we can file it under "Be careful what you ask for." The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Again, the metaphor is apt because God appears as the agent of destruction, leveling the old story, revealing the idea of the contract itself as a sin against the nature of the world he has created. Job's understanding is too small, ridiculously limited to his human perspective, and made stunningly insignificant in the big picture. It turns out that God, too, is a fine poet, and not a little sarcastic, as we hear him chide his servant Job. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, Job, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare, if you know all this, where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, that you may take it into its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? Surely you know, Job, for you were born then, right? And the number of your days is great. Have you entered into the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way, Job, to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? God's soliloquy goes on for quite a while, like a long time. And Job's response is the same as that of his friends when they first saw him. Silence, or at least saying that he will be silent. See, I am of no account. What shall I answer you, God? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but will proceed no further. I am of small account. And there is the precise moment when Job's old story ends and a new one begins. Stories that put us as individuals, cultures, or a species at the center of the world and as the measure of all things are stories that are ready to be leveled by the whirlwind. When we remember that we're caught in a fragile web of relation and in a continuing process, transformation begins to occur. We're brought back to our place, our small and even insignificant existence, surrounded by the ashes and ruins of who we thought we were. The elixir of the gods is now drunk to the dregs, and our best response is silence as a new story is born within us. I am of small account. Before we conclude our interpretation of this story, let us take a moment to note that God turns to Job's friends and tells them that they have not spoken the truth as his servant Job has. The friends' too easy theology is the same as Job's. Suffering is the result of sin, and health and wealth are the result of goodness. On this they both agree. They only question whether Job has sinned or not. As the whirlwind reveals, it is the wrong question, and God has left that theology in ruins. In 2020, we might want to test that story as well, because even if we deny it personally, it is an effective story culturally and nationally. We see it when we conflate wealth with goodness and poverty with poor choices. One thing that the whirlwind of COVID-19 has revealed is some truths about wealth and poverty that have been either hidden or have existed in the background. What is the new story that will emerge now? Let us see what happened with Job and then apply it to us here in the pandemic. Actually, it is a rather unexpected ending for this evocative and beautiful story, and it causes quite a bit of confusion for the purveyors of the old story, both Job, his friends, and the generations of readers who will follow. So we're entering into the realm of paradox, where, as Brooks noted, the poet must work by analogies, but the metaphors do not lie in the same plane or fit neatly edge to edge. The ending of Job and the story of that ending are especially instructive for seekers in troubled times. Job's last words to God are these: I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job acknowledges that he does not know as much as he thought he knew, and thereby puts himself back into the fragile web of relation that he was born into. He is back in his place. Now, if we hearken back to his first response to his initial suffering and loss, way back in the first chapter, we can see that it is essentially the same. Remember, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground and worshipped and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. In fact, the odd phrase, naked shall I return there, now becomes clear. There is both his mother's womb and the metaphor, the ancient metaphor of the earth as mother, and ourselves as dust, which itself connects to Job's repentance in dust and ashes. As we saw in the last lecture, recognizing that there is something greater than us, something that gives us life and to which we will return in death, relieves us of our own superiority. Job has lost his sense of importance and found instead his relation to a web of meaning that precedes and will outlast him. If the last two lines about Job despising himself and repenting strike an odd note to you, there is a good and quite interesting reason for that. In fact, if you know this text, you know that the story continues after this. And because Job repents and despises himself, he gets his old life back, in a way, as the narrator informs us. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 new sons and 3 new daughters. And he names the first Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Keren-hapuk. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations, and Job died old and full of days. Okay, what is it that Job needs to repent of? God told him he spoke the truth, and why should he despise himself? Perhaps I'm reacting too strongly to the word despise and to the very real dangers of despising oneself. The American Standard Version here reads abhor. Job abhorred himself, and includes a variant reading of I loathe my words. And even though I could go on and on about loathing one's words as opposed to despising oneself, I will not do that since it is clear that the extant text speaks of despising or abhorring oneself. The point here is that the epilogue sits in contrast with the rest of the story. Why the hell would new livestock and children balance out the previous losses? Whose is this sing-song voice soothing us with the old story that it all worked out fine in the end? Something is wrong here. What happened? It turns out that the story of the story has a lesson for seekers as well. Let me explain. Biblical texts like Job are ancient and well-traveled. In their travels and over time, they change. First of all, they begin as oral stories that are ephemeral in nature. Even when they're written down, additions, deletions, and other edits occur to meet the needs of the readers and especially the editors. Later writers change the story for their own purposes and needs. So what happened with this text? Someone changed this story back into the old paradigm because it was too uncomfortable. Job's new story was too new, too challenging for later editors. Recalling the experiment with the anomalous deck of cards from last week, we can say that the editor of Job, or at least one of them, saw a red 6 of spades and painted over it in black. While we do not know the compositional history of Job, we do see from a literary and philosophical perspective that the ending was added on. And frankly, I think it is offensive to careful readers and seekers of wisdom. At least it is offensive to me. It is also instructive. Biblical scholars have noted this textual anomaly, and once you look at the structure of the story, it becomes apparent to everyone, I would think. What about the ending then? Sure, it appears that part of the story ends with Job despising himself, repenting, and getting new livestock and children. And now we have a story for Sunday school, but not for seekers. Fortunately, stories are dynamic and turn in on themselves, and so we can tell this one about the ending. The renowned translator Stephen Mitchell has another reading of the ending, one that is consistent with the rest of the story and with the world's wisdom traditions. He offers us an alternate reading of the word for repent, one warranted by scholarship. Listen and hear what rings truer for me, and maybe for you too, as the better ending for the book of Job. Therefore I will be quiet, comforted that I am dust. Quiet, sitting in silence, comforted that I am dust. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. What a relief no longer to be the center and apex of the world. What a relief to be like dust, like the earth, from which I came and to which I will return. How comforting to be quiet and let go of all my schemes and mechanisms for upholding a story that is no longer mine. As a reader and as a seeker, I say that that is the only appropriate ending to the book of Job, and I am comforted that I am dust. At the end here, let us look at one more aspect of new stories emerging. Remember that Job actually spoke his new story before he enacted it. When he cries out that he was naked when he was born and will return to his mother earth naked, he has it. There it is. But he does not have it quite yet because that story has not been enacted. He is pantomiming his new story, saying what he thinks he should say, not what rises from within him to say. Put another way, it is a story he had heard but not yet lived. And that is okay, because that is how new stories emerge. They actually are already here. We just cannot see them yet and have not lived them yet. As such, they are esoteric or hidden, waiting to be revealed and lived as soon as we let go of the old ones. We can see that this is the case because new stories are not dramatically different from the old ones, which is its own kind of comfort. Like musical notes, there are only so many stories in the world. It's how we relate and recombine them that makes them new. To hear and enact a radically different story would be psychologically and culturally devastating, not to mention, I think, probably impossible. After all, this world is fragile, and so are we. So we seek survival first and meaning second, until eventually they are the same thing. The great theorist Roland Barthes taught us something simple and profound about the process of new stories emerging in his underappreciated book, Mythologies. The epilogue to the book is an essay titled Myth Today, and in it we read this: Myth is speech stolen and restored. Only speech which is restored is no longer quite that which was stolen. When it was brought back, it was not put exactly in its place. It is this brief act of larceny, this moment taken for a surreptitious faking, which gives mythical speech its benumbed look. But there always remains around the final meaning a halo of virtualities where other possible meanings are floating. The meaning can almost always be interpreted. Myth is stolen language, and it steals from other myths, especially those that are dead or dying. This means that our new story is already here, and we might have already begun telling it. It exists in that halo of virtualities around our old story. And that halo was always there, always available to us to remake ourselves and the world. We just need the proper motivation to enter the halo. And that usually comes from fear, loss, and suffering. We leap when the ground beneath us is crumbling. Despite all the things that the novel coronavirus will do to us, one thing that it will do for us is give us permission to enter the halo of meanings that surround our old stories and the urge to enact them. We can actually see these new stories emerging now, and you can watch the language theft happening live. Some of my favorite news stories can be found coming from COVID-19 itself, as writers take on the persona of the virus. In these stories, the virus is sometimes plaintive, sad that we humans are so weak and stupid. In most of the virus-authored stories I have read, however, the virus is angry, which diminishes the literary quality of the piece somewhat in favor of the author's projection. Here's one I found on a French site titled simply, "What the Virus Said," that has the virus being quite French. If nearly all of you had not become, over the last century, redundant copies of a single untenable form of life, you would not be preparing to die like flies abandoned in the water of your sugary civilization. You can almost smell the cigarettes and black coffee. More direct and serious, perhaps, is Joe Pinkster's article in The Atlantic titled, "The Pandemic Will Cleave America in Two." He notes ominously, "In the coming months and years, there will really be two pandemics in America. One will be disruptive and frightening to its victims, but thanks to their existing advantages and lucky near misses with the virus, they will likely emerge from it relatively stable, physically, psychologically, and financially. The other pandemic, though, will devastate those who survive it, leaving lasting scars and altering life's courses. Which of these two pandemics any given American will experience will be determined by a morbid mix of a sort of demographic predestination, shaped strongly by inequality and purely random chance." Writing in Vice, Harry Cheadle begins by citing Politico's survey of 30 smart macro thinkers on what we might call the new stories that will emerge after the pandemic. They predicted a decrease in toxic partisanship, a renewed trust in experts and science, greater government involvement in pharmaceutical production, and transformations to elections that could include widespread voting by mail and electronic voting. But his article is titled, "We're Being Too Optimistic About What Post-Pandemic America Will Look Like." He counters the optimism of these experts with this statement: "There are already signs that in many ways the world will snap back to normal at the first available opportunity. The notion that COVID-19 will shock us into being more responsible about climate change or will lead us to reform our institutions underrates the sheer force of inertia that made us so vulnerable to the virus in the first place. Sure, coronavirus should be a wake-up call on so many fronts, but leaders, particularly in the United States, are likely to just hit the snooze button." He may be remembering 9/11, when we thought everything had changed. And we may have even been ready for a new story then, but we were told to go shopping. That is because there are people in power who want to remain in power. They are the contemporary equivalent of Job's friends and the later editors of the book of Job. On May 1st, the New Yorker published an article by Kim Stanley Robinson titled, "The Coronavirus is Rewriting Our Imaginations." And she has a subtitle that reads, "What felt impossible has become thinkable." The spring of 2020 is suggestive of how much and how quickly we can change as a civilization. She rightly claims that science fiction has some stories we can steal to use in the new world. And I bet you too, have learned more about statistics and modeling than I ever thought I would. And one old story, that of science, is more relevant than ever, though it is not without its own transformations. Mostly, we are living with uncertainty, the bane of the stock market, but the nature of life on earth. Just ask Job. An anguished voice crying from a desert thousands of years ago speaks to me in the 2020 pandemic and in the catastrophes to come. I am comforted that I am dust. These words have helped new stories to be born in me, stories emerging from destruction and loss, stories, as we read in ceremony, that are, quote, filled with the intricacies of a continuing process and with a strength inherent in spiderwebs woven across paths through sandhills, where early in the morning the sun becomes entangled in each filament of web, unquote. Such raw beauty can be found here in the pandemic, arising only when the ruins of our old stories are left behind. To be relieved of understanding everything and of being the most important thing on the planet is the gift of our changing story. To be relieved of the demands of an obsolete story is a severe mercy. What Manly P. Hall understood, and what the Philosophical Research Society continues, is that stories such as this one from 2,500 years ago contain ideas that are applicable and relevant to our lives today, especially during troubled times. The world's wisdom is the best that has been thought, said, and applied by people throughout history and across the world, using many different metaphors and symbols, but addressing similar experiences of loss and suffering, as well as living well and balanced lives. This fact in itself is a remarkable and a global benevolence, humanity's best gift to itself. Thank you for your attention.